over the next, I forget how many sessions, I think 6 sessions, we're going to be looking at the subject of giants. And you might be saying to yourself, well, why study giants? So many subjects in the Bible that we could choose from, and you've chosen to talk about giants. Why, for example, will we do a study of giants when we could just as feasibly, for example, do a study on dragons in the Bible and research all the places in the Bible dragons occur? Now, some of you will be thinking, well, there are no dragons in the Bible. You're misreading a verse. Of course I am. We could look at another subject. We could do something really self-serving, and I could do an investigation of phoenixes in the Bible in a vain attempt to justify why I called my son Phoenix. Or we could even do 6 studies, if we wanted to, on unicorns in the Bible. All words that show up in the Bible. But we've chosen to look at giants. And I hope by the end of our study tonight, it's going to make sense why this is a really worthwhile study for us to be doing together, for us to share time on together. I hope you're excited by this subject. I am. I really think this is a really exciting and interesting subject. And when you think about it, what's not to be excited about? Ever since we were children, I'm sure we've felt that any story that involved giants was bound to be a good one. For example, Sunday school, and we came up to that point in the Sunday school series when we were doing David and Goliath, and you knew that was going to be a great lesson. And after Sunday school, out you'd go and you'd swing slings out on the lawns behind the hall and slay giants. You knew it was going to be a good Sunday when it involved giants. Or that feeling of, that frisson of fear when you're hearing the story of Jack and the Beanstalk for the first time, and then you're lying in bed afterwards, wondering if maybe giants are real. If that's what maybe made that scary creaking sound down towards the end of the bed. Because that's the point, isn't it? Giants were scary. Giants, they were the stuff of nightmares. Terrible creatures who lurk in the dark, coming out to invade our dreams, standing there like the cast of night terrors with all the monsters from under the bed. Night wolves and all sorts of... Cyrus a little while ago was having night terrors quite often, and he was telling us about the particularly scary dog that he was seeing in his dream that kept on eating his food and wearing terrifying hats. Giants were scary. But then we grew up. And under the scrutiny of adult eyes, they faded and they shrunk, and finally they were packed away in the toy box of childhood memories. Except that unlike night wolves and bed monsters and hat-wearing dogs, giants were once very real. All through the childhood of God's nation, giants roamed the rugged mountain areas of the land. And when you think about it, there were a surprising number of them. There are a surprising number of them, and quite a surprising number of stories to do with encounters with these terrifying giants. Clearly, giants loomed large in the minds of Israelites. And over the next few studies, what we want to do is look at the giants in the lives of faithful men of old. We're going to follow a number of these characters, plus a couple of others. The first mention of giants is back in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. You can turn there if you want, but I've got it up on the screen from the New English translation, where it talks for the first time in the Bible about giants. And it says, the Nephilim, the giants, were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God would sleep with the daughters of humankind who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes, the Ha-Giborim of old, the famous men. So what we're reading about here is giants. The word you can see on the screen before you is the Hebrew word. It's the word Nephilim. And it comes from a root meaning to fall. It's a very, very old word, but it has this idea of fall. The word is so ancient that we don't really know whether the word was intended to indicate terrifying warriors who felled all before them, like great lumberjacks at war, or whether they themselves were the fallen, apostate ones, fallen away from the truth and from the family of God. Perhaps both is true. But the Nephilim here are described as being the children of marriages between the family of Seth, known in this passage as the sons of God, and the spawn of Cain, the daughters of men in this passage. And it appears either way we read this word Nephilim, whether we read it as being fellers, those who fell others, or fallen themselves, either way, this word holds truth. Because these people in the time of Noah were famous, mighty men. Ha-Gibborim is the Hebrew. And they were clearly a key contributor to God's assessment of the earth at this time, when he said it was iniquity always before him. Everywhere God looked in the world at that time, there was just evil continuously and man's evil imagination. These people were clearly violent, apostate, fallen fellows of their fellow men. Now this word Nephilim, it just shows up one more time again in the whole of the Bible. But it's useful because it gives us a much clearer picture of what made these Nephilim the Ha-Gibborim of Noah's time, the fallen mighty champions of Noah's age. What made them so significant? And interestingly enough, the only other time this word shows up is in the chapter we've just read this evening. It's in verse 33. It says there in Numbers 13, verse 33, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which came of the giants. Numbers 13, verse 33. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. And here what we're told is that in Hebron, the 12 spies saw the Hebrew word Nephilim, the sons of one Anak. That's what the Hebrew says. There we saw Nephilim, the only other occurrence of this Hebrew word, the sons of Anak, which were, says Moses, the descendants of the Nephilim. And that's a problem, isn't it? Because these men that were seen on the walls of Hebron by the 12 spies clearly were not the descendants, not the genetic descendants of the Nephilim of Noah's time, were they? Doesn't matter how well these giants could swim, they were not going to outswim the flood and must have perished. Only 8 souls were saved by water. And yet, still, there was something about the inhabitants of Hebron, when observed by the 12 spies from a safe distance outside Hebron's walls, that evoked old stories and ancient memories. So, what detail do you think that the 10 spies noted about the distant figures that they could see striding about Hebron's fortifications? What was it that they saw that so filled them with terror and with worry as they looked up at those walls they wished to capture? Well, they say it themselves, don't they? They say in this very verse, we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. As a grasshopper is to a man, so we felt before them. And so they must have looked on us. the immense size of at least 3 of the warriors on those walls was what horrified them. Presumably, it was clear, even from a distance, that the people they were looking at were of vast size, perhaps because they could compare at least 3 of the warriors on the walls with other people, normal-sized people on the walls. Perhaps there was a clear basis of comparison as they looked up and they saw, hold it, there's something wrong with they're giants. The heights were all wrong. Hundreds of normal-sized soldiers on these walls, and 3 where the height is just wrong, even at this distance. And so they looked up, and they could see, by comparison, something was horribly wrong. How did they know when they looked up what tribe these men belonged to? Without talking to them, they say, look, they're the sons of Anak. How did they possibly know that? Without talking to them. I mean, one assumes they didn't walk into Hebron, knock on the door, hello, we're about to capture you. We're wondering if before we capture you, you could identify us. Are you the sons of Anak? Of course not. It was because these sons of Anak were famous. Here's what Deuteronomy 9 says. Go in and possess the land, and you'll see there a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, whom thou knowest, and of whom thou hast heard say, who can stand before the children of Anak? These Anakim were so famous that even a people who had spent years and years in slavery in Egypt, as it were, hidden away down there, and then the last 12 months in the wilderness, away from all newspapers and news, knew exactly who these people had to be. Everybody knew about the Anakim. You could tell them a mile off. Clearly, this was what frightened the men. Clearly, in the minds of the spies, Noah's Nephilim had been giants, and therefore these terrifying figures on the walls of Hebron, who were giants, must be Nephilim. Can you see the maths there? They say to themselves, Noah, giants. Great, got that. We're looking at giants. The only giants we know of previous to this occasion are Nephilim. There must be Nephilim. There must be Nephilim too. And Moses, in writing the book of Genesis, clearly saw a connection between these Nephilim and the Nephilim of before also. Because even though all of the Nephilim of Noah's time died in the flood, he noted that there would be Nephilim again. Do you see that? Back in Genesis 6, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, in the time of Noah, and also, says Moses, writing from the vantage point of 1,000 years later on, and also after this. Moses wrote those words because he knew that he'd seen them again. He'd seen them again. And Moses clearly saw a connection. He knew that those Nephilim had died, and yet there was somehow again in the earth great giants of apostate violence. He was seeing them on the walls of Hebron. Now I want to be clear. I'm saying that the Nephilim of Noah's time and the Nephilim of the time of Moses were not genetically connected. They cannot be. But what I am saying is that those who looked on them saw a connection. They drew a direct line in their mind back to those terrors of the time before the flood. And they saw in these giants on Hebron's walls an echo. And I think also there's another connection between the Nephilim of Noah's time and the giants of Moses' time. Because you see, there's another word used to describe these giants. Come with me, if you'd be so kind, to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy 2. And Moses speaking says this. Deuteronomy 2, verse 10, he says, "The Emims dwelt therein in a particular part of the land in times past." Now these Emims, he says, were a people great and many and tall as the Anakims. So he says, look, the Emims, giants, like the Anakims. They're great and tall. Which also, just in case we missed the point, were giants as the Anakims. He doesn't want us to miss this point. But the Moabites called them Emims. So the Emims, and there's lots of families of giants in the Bible, many of them. But the Emims here, we're told, were accounted giants like the Anakims because they were great and tall. Except that this word here, in verse 11, they were accounted giants. It's not the word Nephilim. In fact, it doesn't even mean giants at all. Almost every other version, and some of you will have these versions on your lap, say the word Raphaim. The Hebrew word Raphaim. So ESV, Amplified, Septuagint, RSV, RV, Young's Literal, and others. Like the Anakim, they were also counted as Raphaim. Now, Raphaim comes from a word that means to drop down, as though dead. Drop down dead. That's the root of this word. And in many places, it's actually translated as the dead, the shades of the dead ones. In fact, often in the Psalms, when the psalmist wished to describe the sensation of what it would be like to be dead, even though the psalmist knew that there was no sensation in death, they would poetically describe them as being among the dead shades, among the dead ones. That's this word. And I think that's the point here. Because when these people saw these giants and they saw them on the walls, they saw, as it were, a shade, a ghost, as it were, of all that had died in the flood in Noah's time, all that should have remained dead, all that led the world to catastrophe. And yet, here they are. Here they are on the walls of Hebron, like creatures climbed out of a grave. They should not be there, but somehow they were. God had killed them all in the flood, and yet somehow they still lived. And so they called them the Raphaim, the sons of the dead, perhaps the sons of the dead Nephilim. And so, it's not altogether surprising that when the 10 spies saw the Anakim, 10 of them were horrified. It was early July, and Israel, led by Moses, had now reached the edge of the wilderness. They were camped at Kadesh, on the southern edge of the promised land, at the bottom of a range of ever-climbing hills that rose like steps away to the north, peaking at Hebron, the city where the covenant faithful Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah were all rolled together in the grave, awaiting the kingdom. A very special place, sacred ground to every Israelite. For the people coming out of Egypt, now the promised land would feel so very close. Their inheritance was just a brief hours march away. The wilderness was behind them. Turn back one page and have a look at what Moses says in Deuteronomy 1, verse 19. I love this description here of the wilderness. Moses says, "And when we departed from Horeb," verse 19, "we went through all that great and terrible wilderness, which he saw by the way of the mountain of the Amorites, as Yahweh our God commanded us, and we came to Kadesh Barnea." And I said to you, you've come unto the mountain of the Amorites, which Yahweh our God doth give unto us. Behold, Yahweh your God hath set up the land before you. Go up and possess it, as Yahweh God of your fathers hath said unto thee. Fear not, neither be discouraged. Did you note that little phrase? I hope you did, because I really tried to emphasize it as I read it. Fear not, he says. Moses clearly anticipated that the people would need their courage, that they would need their faith. He anticipated that the conquest of the promised land would hold existential threats for them. There was reason to be afraid, which is why he said, fear not. It was the people who suggested that they survey the land prior to entering it. Verse 22, you came near unto me, every one of you, and you said, we will send men before us, and they shall search us out the land, and bring us word again, by what way we must go up, and into what cities shall we come? And the saying pleased me. And I took 12 men. God agreed, but it was their idea to send in spies. And on the surface, it sounded like a really good idea. Let's send some guys up before everybody else comes in to map out the land for us. They'll go up and they'll find the right routes. You know, we'll avoid all the toll routes. We don't want to be paying extra money on the way up. Avoid any traffic problems, as I experienced down south with road closures. We'll make sure we avoid all of that, so we've got a nice straight route through the middle of the land. Someone will sort all of that out before we get there. But you see, God knew what they would see. He knew what they would see in that land already. It was up to them, though, how they reacted to those sights. He knew that they were going to see the cast of nightmares on the walls of the cities, the shades of long dead sinners guarding the heartland of the promise. He knew. But it was up to them how they responded. Well, they went up, sticking, it seems, to the concealment of the craggy heights, fearful of being recognised and hunted perhaps, marching by night and sleeping in the mountain tops to avoid detection, marching until finally the 12 spies reached the border of Syria in the north, before turning south and now disguised by a southern route, pretending to be visitors from a non-threatening north, they came south. Now they didn't look like those crazed barbarians everyone had heard of, who were welling up out of the wilderness, who had just destroyed Pharaoh's army. Now they looked like, they looked like tourists on tourist visas, coming south to visit and see the sights. And so they explored the land that God had promised. And Numbers chapter 13, if you go back there, tells us that there were two events of note on their route south. Numbers 13 and verse 22, it says, they ascended by the south and came unto Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of Anak, were. They saw 3 giants on Hebron's battlements. But this event is then contrasted with another event in verse 23. And they came to the brook Eshcol and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bare it between two upon a staff, and brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. So they found a cluster of grapes, it seems so large, so giant, we might say, that it took two to carry it at Eshcol. Found this cluster of grapes at a place called Eshcol. A giant cluster of grapes. And yet, where they found this cluster of grapes is, well, it's almost as important. It was at Eshcol. We're going to come back to this location a couple of times. You see, Eshcol means a cluster. That is, a cluster of grapes. At a place called a cluster of grapes, they found a cluster of grapes. And you think to yourself, well, that's not very useful, is it? This name shows up in the context of the 12 spies. This story, and only one other place in the Bible. And when that happens, it usually means there's something we should spot. Let's go to the other place Eshcol shows up. Genesis chapter 14. Same Hebrew word in Genesis 14. Verse 13. Now, I know some of you are saying, yes, but when is he going to get to giants? We will just at the end tonight. Verse 13. And there came one that had escaped. That is, escaped from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by the foreign invaders led by Kedorlaomer. So one came who had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, who was brother of Eshcol and brother of Anak. And these three, Mamre, Eshcol, and Anak, were confederate with Abraham. So at this point in time, Abram is living in Mamre, that is Hebron, the very place we're talking about. And he's confederate with some Amorites. Amorites just means mountain dwellers, by the way. But that word confederate is much more interesting because it means breakers of bread. Abraham broke bread with a group of men, including one called Eshcol. Do you know what Abraham, Eshcol, and the others he's confederate with do in this chapter? Well, they collect together a crack army of soldiers, 318 trained warriors, trained as tent raisers and chefs, pastry makers and goat herders in Abraham's household. And with this small army of non-soldiers, together with these three breakers of bread, Abram pursues after a mighty army which has just destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. But more than that, do you know what else that mighty army had just done? They had just marched through 4 tribes of giants, wiping them out one after the other. And now Abram pursues an army of giant killers and destroys them. If you like, Abram's army were giant killers. What an amazing thing. Verse 5 tells us about that. Verse 5 says, Kedorlaomer had gone through and smitten the Raphaim, you'll recognise that name, in Ashtaroth Canaan. We'll actually come back to that name again on another occasion. The Zuzims in Ham, the Emims in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites, all of them families of giants. And Abram and Eshcol and the others destroy this army that was far stronger than 4 tribes of giants. They rescue Lot, and then they head to Jerusalem to meet with Melchizedek. An amazing chapter. And just after seeing giants, in the very place where Abraham and Eshcol live together, the spies get proof that the promised land is all that God promised. At a place that just happens to be named after a giant killer, Eshcol, they get this enormous cluster of grapes that proves that the land does flow with, well, maybe not milk and honey, but certainly with wine and pomegranates. God knew what they would see. He knew they would see proof of the bounty of the promised land, but how they responded was up to them. And so the spies return from their trip back in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 22. A return, and in verse 27, Numbers 13 verse 27, they give their report. 13 verse 27. And they told him, that is Moses, and said, "We came into the land whither you sent us, and surely it flows with milk and honey. Look at the fruit of it. It took 2 of us to carry this back." But, verse 28, "Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great, and we saw the children of Anak there." Oh, that's a bit depressing, but it's accurate. The spies have said nothing that is not true yet. The people were strong. The cities were walled. Why? When later on archaeologists uncovered the walls of Lachish, a city that they were going to capture soon, they were as much as 8 feet thick in some places. And yes, we already know there were giants. Verse 30, Caleb stilled the people. He speaks. And he stilled them because obviously at the mention of the name of the giants, that we saw giants, that the whole crowd listening would have gone, "Ooh." And Caleb says, hold it. Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. A murmur had gone through the people at the mention of Anak, but Caleb says, it's okay. We can do this with God with us. But verse 31, the men that went up with him said, "We are not able to go up at once. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." Here's how they responded to what they saw. And this is very different to Caleb and Joshua. They didn't say, "Look, it'll be difficult." They didn't say, "Look, let's not rush into this. Perhaps we need to send some more spies, work out a bit of a plan, maybe put together a few committees and we'll sort out a plan." No, it's simply, we cannot do this. And worse, verse 32, they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, "The land through which we have gone, so we saw it, we saw everything, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people we saw in it were men of great stature. This is a land that swallows up people," they said, "and everyone in it is huge. Most of the people are giants." Verse 33, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which came of the giants. We were as grasshoppers. Everywhere we looked, they were all huge. The walls of every city, 50 stories high easily. And every single person was a giant, and they all drove in enormous trucks, and they were so scary, we can't do anything here. We just can't." And you can see their problem. Starting at the end of verse 32, "All the people that we saw in it were men of great stature, and there we saw the giants. In our own sight we were as grasshoppers." That's how we were in their sight. We looked and we saw. And their eyes bred fear in their minds. They saw, well, what did they see? 3 tall silhouettes on Hebron's walls, But now everyone looked like a giant to them. Their terrors were growing and multiplying. The monsters had come crawling out from the bed. Little wonder that chapter 14 verse 1 says, "And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept all night." The whole camp had nightmares that night, and there wasn't a tent where there wasn't someone being patted back to sleep. Verse 2, "And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, 'Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt,' or alternatively, 'Would God we had died in the wilderness.'" Wow, just 3 giants. And suddenly death seemed better. Verse 3 and 4, "Wherefore hath Yahweh brought us up?" They start blaming God. "Why did he bring us up out of this land? Was it to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Look, it would be better for us to go back to Egypt to be slaves than to be here." And they said to one another, "Let us make a captain and let us return to Egypt." They start looking for a captain. By verse 10, they're ready to stone Moses and Joshua and Caleb to death. Probably there's someone out there in the camp right now tapping Korah on the shoulder saying, "Now's your chance." The only thing that saved Moses and Caleb and Joshua on this occasion is the sudden appearance of something very, very familiar, and yet somehow far more arresting: a cloudy pillar of fire, twisting away into the heavens above them, far taller than any giant. Taller than them, taller than giants, taller even than Hebron's walls, twisting into the heavens, a reminder of everything that they'd suddenly forgotten. Because we know the story, don't we? But in their fear, they had forgotten the sound of sobbing Egyptians, hadn't they? They had forgotten the walls of Red Sea water towering beside them, and the sound at their back of those walls crashing in as they stood on the shores on the far side. They had forgotten their victory over Amalek. Moses' hands aloft, they win. Moses' hands down, they lose. They had forgotten water from the rock. They had forgotten bread from the sky. They had forgotten God marching with them. But Caleb hadn't. Verse 9. "Only," says Caleb, "rebel not ye against Yahweh, neither fear ye the people of the land. For they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not." Bread for us. Bread for us. It's a really funny phrase, that one. What does he mean? Well, I'm not going to go into the passages right now, just to save a little time. But just think for a minute. What did wilderness bread do in the heat of the day? It melted, didn't it? And I think that's exactly what Caleb is saying about the people of the land. He's saying, look, don't worry. They'll melt before us, before the heat of God's gaze. Angels will march before us. They'll be as nothing. We'll collect them up and put them in baskets and they'll melt away. But for God, this was the final straw, wasn't it? Rather than remember how God had rescued them from all their fears, they allowed what they saw in their mind's eye. And bear in mind, there's only 10 people in the whole nation who have seen these giants. 12 who've seen these giants, and only 10 who are worried about them. But the people allowed what they had seen in their mind's eye to be greater than all that God had done, and to conquer their faith. Rather than remember the God who had remembered them from all their fears, they visualized giants. The people hadn't seen giants, most of them, but now they're seeing giants that are taller than God. And so God is so disappointed, he's so angry that in chapter 14, verse 22, he says, because all these men which have seen my glory, they saw my pillar of fire, they saw the Red Sea rescue, they saw water in the wilderness, they saw bread from heaven, they saw it all. And they were scared of things they had not even seen because of that. Because they've tempted me now 10 times. They have not listened to what I said to them. Surely they will not, oh, we get the word, don't we? See the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoked me see it. And for the next 40 years, their desiccated corpses will fall like autumn leaves from the tree. Their lifespans artificially shortened, their aging accelerated until none over 20 on this particular day remain. Those who stood at Kadesh have all died save Moses and Caleb and Joshua. For 40 years, they wandered the wilderness completely safe from giants. No giants in the wilderness. But they were ravaged by God's wrath. Would God we had died in the wilderness, they had said, and they did. Okay, but now that generation is dead. We're going to fast forward. Generation is dead, and Moses begins the work of preparing the nation for the conquest of the promised land. Flick over to chapter 21. Chapter 21 and verse 10. Here they are. They're about to move up the eastern side. I always get my east and west wrong. I'm going to say the western side, but no, the eastern side is right. The eastern side of the Dead Sea up towards the promised land. And it says, and the children of Israel set forth and they pitched in Oboth. They journeyed from Oboth and they pitched in Ijjaberam in the wilderness which is before Moses toward the rising sun. Verse 20, where are we? Verse 21. Israel, I've missed a verse here. They're marching up the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Verse 21, pardon me. Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your land. We won't turn into your fields. We won't go into your vineyards. We won't drink even the waters of your well. We'll bring our own. But we will go along the king's highway. We'll march smartly straight through your land. We won't litter. It'll be clean and tidy when we're gone until we be past your borders. But Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through. Sihon gathered all his people together and went out to Israel into the wilderness to fight them. So here they are. This is going to be the first battle for the new generation. And this battle is one that is forced on them by Sihon, the Amorite king. It's one of defense, not of attack. Moses says Israel do not wish to fight this battle, but they will have to. And it's going to be quick. They win the battle and Sihon is defeated. So that's their first battle that's forced on the new generation. What about the first battle they chose? Well, it's here in verse 33. Here's the first battle they chose to fight. Verse 33, they turned and they went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. And Yahweh said to Moses, fear him not, for I have delivered him into thy hand and all his people and his land, and you shall do to him as you did to the Sihon, king of the Amorites, which dwelt at Heshbon. So they smote him and his sons and all his people, till none were left alive, and they possessed his land. It's quite brief, isn't it? Sharp, short, not much detail. But hopefully you all noticed a little phrase there. Fear him not. Verse 34. Why do you think they would fear Og? After all, they've just defeated Sihon, king of Bashan. It was easy. Marched through him as if he was melted butter. Easy as pie, with God at their back. Why did God say, now, don't be worried about Og? Well, come across to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Threading these pieces together. Because we're lucky, we're very privileged in this occasion to have multiple accounts of the same event. Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 1. And we turned and went up the way to Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. This is the same occasion. And the Lord said to me, fear not, don't worry, I will do to you, to Og, as I did to Sihon. This won't be a problem. Verse 11. A little bit more detail about Og. For Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not on Raboth of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth thereof, after the cubits of a man. He's got a bed that's 9 cubits high. 9 cubits long, I guess. Well, let's assume that Og was 1 cubit less than the length of his bed. Because, if you're the same number of cubits as your bed, you find you get wedged in every night. You need to be a little bit less long than your bed. That's a kind of rule. So let's assume he's 8 cubits high. Now, you might wonder, what was so important about his bed that made it worth mentioning? Why didn't the Bible just say, and he was 8 cubits tall? Wouldn't that have been much easier? Why go to all the effort of saying, and he had a big bed? Well, you see, at this point in time, we're still deep in the Bronze Age. And you'll notice there's another detail. It's not just the size of the bed, it's that it's made of iron. Now, to have any iron at all at this time was really something. To have an iron bed, well, that would be absurd. That would be like making a titanium bed today. You might have a little bit of titanium, but to make your whole bed of titanium, that's just ridiculous. It's overkill. No one would do it. No one would spend the enormous amount of money it would cost to make an iron bed unless for some reason you actually needed it. And you see, the thing is, if the scripture is accurate, Og needed it. You've probably seen a body mass index chart, a BMI chart. What it does is it basically says if you're a certain level of fatness and a certain level of height, this is how much you should weigh, give or take. And it's sort of a guideline on how fat and how tall you're going to be at certain weights and those sorts of things. And you can extend it up. Now, if we extend a BMI chart for a person in the normal age bracket up, which you'll be surprised to know that there are no BMI charts available that go up to 4 meters height. I was disappointed, but there are none. I did check. But if you did, and you just sort of extended it up this way and this way, as far as you need to go to reach 4 meters of height along here, so sort of about past where Cameron is, he would need to be, well, according to this, he would be 218 kilograms, which is a lot. Except what that assumes is that he's built like a basketballer, tall and very slim. We've just kind of stretched him, as you can see on the picture there. If we keep him normally proportioned, if we assume he's got the proportions of a normal person, he would have weighed as much as 500 kilograms. That's why he needed an iron bed. That's why it was so remarkable that years later on, it was stored in the museum in Raboth of the children of Ammon, and people would come and, that's it. Now I know. I understand. He must have been huge. Not only that, you see, Moses wasn't just fighting one giant who weighed half a ton. Numbers 21, we don't need to turn it up, verse 35, just reminding ourselves of this, says he had sons, plural, which means at least two. In other words, Moses had to fight at least 3 giants, not just one, at Edrei. Now, verse 1 tells us, let's get through this story relatively quickly. Verse 1 tells us that Og, king of Bashan, came out to fight us. He left his capital, which we read in Genesis chapter 14, was Ashtaroth-Karnaim, and he came down to fight them at Edrei. Now again, this is a very unusual thing. If you think about it, normally your capital is your best defended city. That's where you build the big walls and the armaments and all those sorts of things, your capital. But not for Og. He chose to fight at Edrei. And you might say, why Edrei? Well, because 2 reasons. Edrei was in itself a massively fortified fortress. But we're led to believe by the archaeologists that it had a second feature set. Because it had an entire subterranean fortress built underground. Imagine what that means. Moses defeated a 13-foot monster, 2 of his sons, all of his army, and in all likelihood the battle was conducted in an underground fortress in which your enemy knows every turn, every pitfall, every trap, and switches the lights off. Imagine fighting that. It is the stuff of nightmares. If that isn't for you, I don't know what is. How terrifying. And look at what the record says in verse 3. So Yahweh, our God, delivered into our hands Og, also the king of Bashan, and all his people. We smote him until nothing was left, nothing was remaining. That's it. One verse. One verse. You see, fighting giants is all about fear. Giants are only scary because we make them huge in our minds. And in the dark, we imagine them bigger and larger than life. That's what giants are, brothers and sisters. They are things that we make big and scary in our minds. They are the things that grow more and more threatening the more we think about them. We started by saying that night wolves and the like had faded and shrunk under the scrutiny of our adult eyes, and that we've put them away in the toy box of childish fears and fancies. But giants are real, aren't they? I suspect that most of us have got giants that we're fighting. There are terrifying figures that loom large in our minds, and they grow larger in the dark, don't they? Lying in bed worrying about them, and they get bigger and bigger. Most of us have fears and doubts and anxieties and worries that prey on us, and we feel as though we're grasshoppers before these problems. I have them. Personality flaws that I can't fix, and a broken friendship I don't know how to mend, and sometimes even doubts and fears about my faith and the ecclesia and my place in them. It's not unusual, but well, over the next few nights and studies, we want to talk about giants. Not just about 13-foot monsters on distant battlements, but also about the giants of today. We're no different to the Israelites, brothers and sisters. We too face giants. God knew we would. It's up to us how we deal with them. The American president, FDR, faced the Great Depression and Hitler's Third Reich, giants of his own, and he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He wasn't completely right, but he was close. In fighting giants, the problem isn't really the giant, is it, brothers and sisters? Giants died like anyone else. Moses, an old man at the point at which he fought Og, proved that, and David will prove it too. What did David have? A pebble. The problem with giants is that they make us afraid. And I know that sounds overly simplistic, but that's what it's at its core. That's what it is. Fear itself is the giant. And God's answer to that is very, very simple. We've heard it several times tonight. It is fear not. You might think, oh, that's overly simplistic. It's too straightforward. Fear not. Flick across to Deuteronomy 31. This is the last passage I think we'll turn up tonight. Deuteronomy 31, verse 7 and 8. It says this. Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and be of a good courage, for you must go with this people into the land which Yahweh has sworn unto our fathers to give them. You shall cause them to inherit it. And Yahweh, he it is who doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed. There it is. Don't be afraid, he says. But look at what he says in verse 12. Gather the people together, men and women and children, and all the strangers that are within your gates, that they may hear, that they may learn and fear Yahweh your God and observe to do all the words of this law. Don't be afraid of them, says God. Rather, fear me. Is that a contradiction? It's not. It's something that Moses understood. Exodus chapter 20, verse 20 says this. All the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the terrifying things that happened on Mount Sinai. And Moses said to the people, fear not, for God has come to prove you that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. Moses understood this concept. Moses understood that if we recall who God is, and if we bring to mind all the amazing things he has done to save us, our personal Red Sea moments, our personal victories at Raphaim, whatever they might be, our manna, our miracle of the manna, the giants of fear in our lives, well, we'll be able to overcome them. If we can replace the fear of the things that worry us with an awe of what God has done in our lives, we will be able to overcome. I'm going to skip over this passage for the sake of time. I want us to finish here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise instruction. If we can be amazed and filled with reverence and godly fear of what God is doing in our lives, it will help us conquer giants. 1 of John says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. If we can move from being afraid of giants to being awestruck by our God, we will conquer giants.